She moved my fence 6 feet into my yard, so I legally erased her front door. The morning I came home and found my fence gone. Not damaged, not knocked over, but surgically removed and reinstalled 6 feet inside my own property line. I stood on my driveway in silence for a full 30 seconds before I understood what had happened to me. My neighbor's landscaping crew was still there, raking the stolen strip of my lawn smooth, tamping down fresh sod like they were covering a crime scene, while Sandra Bellworth stood at the edge of the new line with her arms crossed and a smile I can only describe as triumphant and deeply satisfied. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "The HOA approved it. You were non-compliant." That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to file a complaint or write a strongly worded letter. I was going to take everything she'd built her little empire on and dismantle it piece by piece, legally, permanently, and completely. My name is Rachel Okafor. I'm 38 years old, a licensed civil engineer, and I've lived at 14 Crest Haven Circle in the Maplewood Glen community of suburban Columbus, Ohio for 4 years with my husband Marcus and our 2 kids, Deja, age 11, and Theo, age 8. We bought this house because of the yard, a wide, flat half-acre lot that backed up to a greenbelt, with a detached garage and a side fence that the previous owners had installed along a surveyed boundary line in 2017. We had it inspected. We had the survey verified. We knew exactly where our property ended. Marcus is a physical therapist who works long hours and coaches Theo's little league on weekends. I work hybrid, mostly from home, which means I'm the one who signs for packages, handles the HOA mail, and knows every single rule in the CC and RS by paragraph number. That detail will matter later. Sandra Bellworth became HOA president of Maplewood Glen 3 years ago after the previous president, a retired schoolteacher named Bob Finley, moved to Tucson. Sandra ran unopposed because nobody else wanted the job. That is the entire democratic foundation of her authority. She's lived in the neighborhood for 11 years, in the largest corner lot on Crest Haven, and she treats that seniority like a military rank. She has opinions about grass height, mailbox angles, holiday decoration timelines, and the exact shade of beige acceptable for garage trim. The first time I met Sandra, she knocked on my door 6 days after we moved in to inform me that the moving truck had left a small oil stain on the curb. She'd already photographed it. She handed me a printed copy of the HOA rules on exterior cleanliness as a welcome gift. I thanked her. I cleaned the stain. I told Marcus that evening that we needed to be very careful about that woman, and Marcus said I was being uncharitable. 4 years later, he has revised that opinion significantly. For the first 2 years, we had no real conflict. I paid dues on time, maintained the yard, repainted the shutters the approved color when they faded, and kept our heads down. Sandra sent us 3 notices total: the oil stain, a flag that apparently flew too close to the garage window, and a wind chime she claimed exceeded decibel limits. The wind chime notice came with a citation and a proposed fine of $40. I responded in writing with the specific HOA section, subsection, and measured decibel reading that proved we were compliant. Sandra rescinded it. She didn't apologize. She never apologizes. I noticed she had a particular pattern. She'd target newer residents, people who didn't know the rules well, people who were too busy to fight back. The Nguyen's on Birchwood got fined 3 times in 1 year for landscaping decisions that were clearly within code. I helped them draft a response. Sandra backed off. That was probably when she started watching me differently. I was the neighbor who knew the rules as well as she did, and she didn't like that. In an HOA, the president's power depends entirely on nobody questioning her interpretations. The fence issue started innocently. Sandra wanted to expand her side garden, and her property line on the north side bumped up against the strip of land between her lot and ours. She'd been eyeing that strip for years. I know this because one of her landscapers, Miguel, mentioned it to me while trimming my hedge. He said she'd been measuring it. In the spring of my 3rd year in the neighborhood, Sandra submitted a proposal to the HOA board to reclassify a shared drainage easement along our street's north side as common property, which would have given the HOA, meaning her, authority over its maintenance and aesthetics. It was a thin legal maneuver, but clever. I submitted a 3-page written objection citing the easement's legal definition under Ohio property law and the original plat documents I'd pulled from the county recorder's office. The board tabled the proposal. Sandra was visibly irritated at the meeting. She kept touching her pearls and smiling that tight-lipped smile. After that, she started sending us notices monthly. Driveway oil residue. Garage door left open past 9 p.m. A basketball hoop in our driveway that she claimed violated the recreational equipment visibility clause, a clause I could not find anywhere in the CC and RS because it does not exist. I responded to every single one in writing, with citations and photographs. I kept copies of everything in a binder. Marcus called it my Sandra file. By spring of year 4, it was 3 inches thick and tabbed by date. The notices escalated in January when Sandra brought a guest to the monthly HOA meeting, a man named Douglas Pratt, who she introduced as a community development consultant. He had a slideshow. It was about property aesthetics and neighborhood cohesion. It felt targeted. Douglas Pratt presented a proposal to redefine standard fence setback in the CC and RS, changing the required distance from the sidewalk from the current language, which referenced the surveyed lot line, to a new fixed measurement that would effectively require some fences to be moved inward. Our fence was specifically mentioned as an example. Sandra had clearly written this proposal herself and hired Douglas to present it so it wouldn't look like a personal vendetta. He fumbled when I asked him to cite the legal basis for a retroactive setback change under Ohio HOA law. He looked at Sandra. Sandra smiled. The board voted 3-2 to table for further review. Sandra controlled 3 of the 5 board votes. Herself, a retired dentist named Philip who did whatever she asked, and a woman named Greta who'd been her friend since the neighborhood was built. The other 2 voted no. I went home and pulled the Ohio Planned Community Act, the Maplewood Glen founding documents, and our deed. I spent 4 hours at the kitchen table, and I found exactly what I expected. Retroactive modification of fence setback rules affecting existing structures required a supermajority vote of the entire homeowner membership, not just the board, and 30 days written notice to affected parties. I sent Sandra a certified letter the next morning outlining this. I CC'd the board. I CC'd the HOA's registered attorney, whose name was on the community's legal filings. I was polite. I was precise. I was not friendly. Sandra did not respond to the letter. The board did not respond. I waited 2 weeks and sent a follow-up. Nothing. I should have known then that silence from Sandra didn't mean retreat. It meant she was already doing something else. In February, Sandra hired a new landscaping company, not Miguel's crew, which she'd used for years, but a larger operation out of Westerville called Greenline Services. She told several neighbors she was upgrading the curb appeal of her property. Nobody thought much of it. I noticed the Greenline trucks parked on our street 3 weekends in a row. They were working on Sandra's property but spending a lot of time near the fence line between our yards. I walked over once and asked what they were doing. The crew lead said they were just doing measurements for a new garden layout. Marcus told me to let it go. He said I was becoming obsessive. I told him I just wanted to know why a landscaping crew needed 3 weekends of measurements for 1 garden bed. He said I needed to trust people more. I said I trusted the survey documents more than I trusted Sandra Bellworth. I was right. I just didn't know how right I was until the morning I came home from dropping the kids at school and found my fence gone. Relocated 6 feet inside my property line, with fresh sod covering the stolen strip, and Sandra standing there smiling like she just won something. I walked across the lawn, the new, smaller, diminished lawn, and I asked Sandra very calmly what had happened. She told me the HOA board had approved a fence relocation order the previous week at a special session she'd called. I had not been notified. I had not been invited. She handed me a single sheet of paper. It was a board resolution, signed by 3 members, herself, Philip, and Greta, dated 4 days earlier. It cited the proposed setback modification that I'd already legally challenged. She'd just gone ahead and done it anyway, using a special session nobody else knew about. I looked at that paper for a long moment. Then I looked at the 6 feet of my yard that now had her sod on it. Then I looked at Sandra. She was already walking back toward her house. She said over her shoulder, "You have 30 days to update your survey map with the county." I went inside and called Marcus. He was with a patient and couldn't talk. I called my mother. She told me to call a lawyer. I called our real estate attorney, Janet Chu, who'd handled our home purchase. She picked up on the 3rd ring and I explained everything in one breath. Janet said 3 things. First, what Sandra did was almost certainly illegal. Second, I needed to get a new survey done immediately to document the original boundary. Third, I needed to stop talking to Sandra and let Janet handle all future communications. I agreed to all 3. By noon, I had a survey company scheduled for the following Tuesday. By 2 p.m., Janet had sent Sandra and the HOA board a cease and desist letter by certified mail, email, and physical delivery. By 4 p.m., Sandra had called every neighbor on our street to tell them I was being litigious and difficult. I know she called them because 3 neighbors texted me variations of the same message within an hour. Deborah from 2 houses down said Sandra told her I was trying to sue the entire HOA. The Nguyen's texted me a laughing emoji and said they'd seen this coming. Marcus came home from work and found me at the kitchen table with my laptop, a yellow legal pad, and a half-eaten sandwich. He sat down and looked at everything. He looked at the cease and desist, the board resolution, the survey appointment confirmation, and my notes. Then he looked at me and said, "Okay, what do we do?" And I loved him for that. Not calm down or is this worth it? Just what do we do? What we did was document everything. I photographed the relocated fence from every angle timestamped. I photographed the original survey stakes that were still visible in 2 spots, proving the old line. I photographed the fresh sod and the disturbed soil beneath it. I wrote a 1,400-word incident report that evening and sent it to Janet. Sandra showed up at our door the next morning. I did not open it. I texted Janet, who texted back, "Do not engage. Do not open the door." I watched Sandra through the peephole. She knocked 3 times, waited, and then turned and walked away. She glanced back once. Her expression was not angry. It was calculating. The Tuesday survey confirmed everything. Our original fence had been installed exactly on the legal property boundary. The new fence was 6 feet, 2 inches inside that line. The stolen strip measured approximately 1,240 square feet, the size of a small apartment. Sandra had taken it without legal authority. Janet filed a formal complaint with the Franklin County Court the same afternoon. We were suing for restoration of the fence to its original position, compensatory damages for the cost of the survey and legal fees, and injunctive relief preventing the HOA board from taking further unilateral action against our property without proper membership vote. Sandra's response was to hold an emergency HOA meeting that Thursday evening, a meeting she'd scheduled by slipping printed notices under doors rather than emailing the list, which meant several people didn't know about it in time. Convenient for her. She controlled the agenda. I went to that meeting. I sat in the front row. I brought my binder. Sandra had prepared a whole presentation about neighborhood aesthetics and property value protection. She never said my name, but every example she used was a photograph of my yard, my garage, my fence line. When she opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand first. I read the exact language from the Ohio Planned Community Act requiring a membership supermajority for structural changes to existing property boundaries. I did it slowly and clearly enough that 3 people in the room were nodding before I finished. Sandra said the board had authority under the emergency provision. I asked her to cite the exact section. She looked at Philip. Philip looked at his shoes. I read the emergency provision aloud. It covered imminent safety hazards, not aesthetic disputes. 2 board members shifted in their chairs. The meeting did not go the way Sandra planned. Afterward, 4 homeowners came up to me separately and said they'd had similar issues with her. One of them, a man named Dale who'd lived on Birchwood for 8 years, said Sandra had threatened to block his deck permit 2 years ago unless he voted her way on a dues increase. That was the first real twist. The information that Sandra had been doing this kind of thing for years with multiple residents, and most of them had been too intimidated or too busy to push back. I was not the first. I was just the first one who pushed back hard enough to make it visible. I asked Dale if he'd be willing to put that in writing. He said he'd think about it. I thanked him, gave him Janet's contact card, and drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in 2 days. Something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to it. Marcus made dinner that night, his chicken stew, the good version with the bay leaves and the slow-cooked carrots, and we sat at the table after the kids were in bed and talked through what we were actually doing. We weren't just trying to get our fence back. We were pulling on a thread. The next morning, I requested the full HOA financial records for the past 3 years under the Ohio Planned Community Act's member inspection rights. I emailed the request to Sandra, to each board member individually, and to the HOA's registered attorney. Legally, they had 10 business days to comply. Sandra sent back a response the same afternoon, not through Janet, directly to my personal email, which our attorney had told her not to do. She said the financial records were under board review for accuracy and would be available at the appropriate time. That is not a legal response. That is a stall. Janet sent her a follow-up notice citing the statute. The clock was ticking. Meanwhile, I started talking to more neighbors. Not to organize, just to listen. What I heard was a pattern so consistent it felt almost orchestrated. Sandra would identify what a homeowner wanted most, then hold it hostage. A variance for a second garage, a gate permit, a landscaping exception, a noise complaint dismissal. She traded favorable HOA rulings for loyalty, silence, or votes. It wasn't just fence theft. It was an entire small-scale system of coercion, and she'd been running it for 3 years right under all of our noses. The week after I filed the court complaint, Sandra pivoted. She stopped trying to engage me directly and started working the neighborhood. She was at the Hendersons' house for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon. She had coffee with Greta every morning on Greta's porch where the whole street could see. She was very publicly calm. That calmness worried me more than her aggression had. I'd seen Sandra angry. Angry Sandra made mistakes. Calm Sandra was strategic Sandra, and strategic Sandra had been operating in this neighborhood for 3 years before I understood what she was doing. On Friday, I got a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. Not Janet's reply, a new letter, stating that the board was initiating a formal property compliance review of our lot. It listed 7 alleged violations: fence placement, driveway surface condition, garage door paint color, porch furniture placement, holiday light storage, tree trimming proximity, and a gutter that was improperly angled. 7 violations in one letter. Janet called it a paper storm, a classic tactic to overwhelm, create legal liability exposure, and force a settlement. Sandra was trying to bury us in compliance issues so that we'd drop the fence dispute in exchange for the violations being dismissed. I photographed every single item on the list that same afternoon. The driveway was clean. The garage door was the approved color. I had the approval letter. The porch furniture was within the permitted dimensions. The holiday lights were inside the garage in labeled bins. The gutters had been professionally cleaned in October. I had the receipts. Janet sent a formal response within 48 hours, with photographic evidence and documentation clearing all 7 violations. She also added a line noting that the timing of this compliance review, filed 1 week after our lawsuit, had the appearance of retaliatory action and would be presented as such in court. Sandra did not back down. She scheduled a property inspection walkthrough, which she was technically entitled to do as HOA president under the CC&RS, and showed up at our house on a Saturday morning with Philip and a clipboard. Marcus answered the door. I prepped Marcus exactly for this moment. He was pleasant, cooperative, and photographed everything Sandra photographed. He offered them water. He pointed out every compliant feature himself before Sandra could comment on it. He was so professionally cordial that Philip visibly relaxed, and Sandra's smile got tighter with every room they passed. They found nothing. Sandra walked our entire exterior, peered into the garage, measured the porch railing clearance, and documented the gutter angle. Everything was in compliance. She left without saying anything except, "We'll be in touch." Philip mumbled something apologetic near the car. After they left, Marcus and I sat in the kitchen and I told him something I hadn't wanted to say out loud yet. I thought Sandra might be hiding something in the HOA finances, and I thought the paper storm was partly designed to distract from the records request. Marcus asked what I meant. I explained that legitimate HOA treasuries don't take 10 business days plus a stall letter to produce standard financial records. Most HOAs keep digital books. A routine inspection request should take 3 days, tops. The fact that Sandra described them as under review for accuracy suggested someone was looking at them very carefully, and not for our benefit. Marcus said, "You think she's skimming?" I said I didn't know. I said I thought the money might explain why she was so willing to do something as legally risky as moving our fence. She needed to keep control of the board, which meant keeping control of who could see the books. That weekend I went back through the HOA meeting minutes I'd collected over the past 4 years. They were public record, available on the community website. I was looking for patterns in spending approvals. What I found made me stop and read the same paragraph 3 times. In the 18 months before Sandra became president, annual HOA landscaping expenses averaged around $14,000. In the 3 years since she took over, they'd averaged $31,000. The vendor that received nearly all of the increased spending was a company called Bellworth Property Services. Bellworth Property Services. I sat with that for a moment. Then I Googled it. Bellworth Property Services LLC, registered in Ohio in 2019, the year Sandra became HOA president. Principal owner, Douglas W. Pratt. The same Douglas Pratt she'd brought to the January meeting to present the fence setback proposal. I called Janet. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Rachel, that is not a fence dispute anymore." I said I knew. She said we needed to talk about who else should be involved. I said I was already thinking about that. The next morning I called the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. I didn't make an accusation. I asked about the process for reporting potential financial misconduct in a homeowners association. The clerk gave me a referral to the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. I wrote down the number. I also called a forensic accountant named David Sue, who Janet had worked with on a previous case. He agreed to do a preliminary review of whatever financial records we could obtain. He quoted me a flat fee for the first 4 hours and said we'd see what we found. I authorized the fee. Meanwhile, Sandra was still running her social campaign. She'd started a neighborhood Facebook group, something Maplewood Glen hadn't had before, and was posting in it daily. Neighborhood updates, landscaping reminders, photos of the common areas she'd improved. She had 43 members in the first week. I joined the group under my own name. I said nothing. I just watched. Sandra posted frequently, always in a tone of warm authority, like a small-town mayor running for a third term. The comments were mostly positive, mostly from people who didn't know what was happening on Cresthaven. What I noticed was that Sandra never posted anything about the lawsuit. She never mentioned the fence dispute. To anyone who only knew about the neighborhood through that Facebook group, everything in Maplewood Glen was fine and well-managed and lucky to have Sandra Bellworth at the helm. On the 9th business day of the financial records request, with 1 day before the legal deadline, Sandra's attorney sent over documents. Not the full records, a summary. A curated, 8-page summary with selected line items and no underlying invoices. No bank statements. No vendor contracts. Janet called it a bucket of sand instead of the beach. Janet filed a motion to compel full disclosure. The court date was set. While we waited, I did something I'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. I went to the county recorder's office in person and pulled the full property records for Sandra's lot, including the original survey, the deed, and the recorded plat. And I found something small, easy to miss, but exact in the way that only matters when you're an engineer who reads survey documents for a living. Sandra's lot, as recorded in the original Maplewood Glen plat from 1998, had a specific setback requirement on its northern boundary, a 6-foot setback for any permanent structure, including fencing. Sandra had a fence on her northern boundary. I'd always assumed it was compliant because she was the one who set the rules. But when I compared the recorded plat setback to the physical location of her fence, using the same survey coordinates I'd used for our dispute, her fence was 4 feet inside the required setback. She had a violation, a real one, documented, measurable, and subject to the same CC&R enforcement authority she'd been weaponizing against me for months. I drove home with photocopied plat documents on the passenger seat and a feeling that I can only describe as the first moment of actual leverage. I didn't report it immediately. I held it. A violation filing would alert Sandra and give her time to fix it before anything else happened. What I needed was for this to surface at the right moment. Publicly, irrevocably, in front of people who couldn't be managed or charmed. That required timing. And timing required patience. I'm an engineer. I know how to hold a variable until its maximum useful moment. I told Marcus. I told Janet. I told nobody else. We kept building the financial case while Sandra kept building her social media presence and her paper storm. The next twist came from a direction I didn't expect. A woman named Carolyn Marsh, who lived on the other side of Sandra's corner lot, showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening. She'd seen the Facebook group drama. Sandra had made a veiled post about neighbors who prefer lawsuits to community, and she had something to tell me. Carolyn said that when she'd moved in 7 years ago, Sandra had told her that the HOA required all new homeowners to use Bellworth Property Services for their initial landscaping setup. She'd paid $1,200 to have her front beds re-edged by a company that she later learned had only been registered for a year and had no certified landscapers on staff. Carolyn said she'd always assumed it was legitimate because Sandra had presented it as mandatory. She hadn't questioned it. She'd been in the neighborhood long enough to know you didn't question Sandra. But now she was questioning it. Now she wanted to know if she was the only one. She was not the only one. Over the next week, I carefully and privately talked to 11 homeowners who'd moved into Maplewood Glen during Sandra's presidency. 9 of them had been told the same thing, that Bellworth Property Services was the HOA recommended, or HOA required, landscaping vendor for new residents. None of them could find anything in the CC and RS requiring it. Because there was nothing. Sandra had invented a requirement and collected fees for a company she was connected to through Douglas Pratt. $1,200 per household, 9 households confirmed, conservatively over $10,000 that bypassed the HOA treasury entirely. David Sue, the forensic accountant, reviewed the partial financial records Sandra's attorney had submitted. He identified 3 years of payments to Bellworth Property Services totaling $93,000. Approved by board resolutions all signed by Sandra, Philip, and Greta. The invoices in the summary were vague. Grounds maintenance, seasonal enhancement, property aesthetic services. David said the invoice descriptions were consistent with a pass-through arrangement, a company billing for services that were either inflated, partially performed, or not performed at all, with proceeds returned to the controlling party. He needed the underlying bank records to confirm, but the pattern was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. I sat in my kitchen with Janet on speaker, David on a video call, Marcus across the table, and my 3-inch Sandra file open in front of me. Janet said, "Rachel, we're not just getting your fence back. We're unwinding the whole thing." I said I knew. I said I was ready. And I meant it. For about 10 days after that kitchen meeting, things went quiet. Sandra stopped sending notices. The Facebook group posts became less frequent. No more compliance inspections, no more letters from the HOA attorney. It felt like the eye of something, and I treated it like one. I worked quietly and didn't mistake the stillness for safety. The kids noticed the tension easing and got back to normal. Theo started leaving his bike in the driveway again without me flinching. Deja had a friend over and they kicked a soccer ball around the backyard. The smaller backyard, still defined by Sandra's stolen 6 feet, and I watched from the window and made myself breathe. Marcus and I took the kids to Easton for dinner on a Friday night, and for 2 hours we talked about nothing related to fences or lawsuits or HOAs. Theo got ice cream. Deja found a bookstore. I ordered pasta and ate the whole plate. Normal felt deliberate, earned, almost sweet. Janet called on Monday with a court update. The motion to compel full financial disclosure had a hearing date. 6 weeks out. The original fence lawsuit was on a parallel track slightly ahead. Sandra's attorney had filed a motion to dismiss the fence case on procedural grounds. A long shot, Janet said, but it would buy them time. I used the quiet to organize. I created a shared folder with Janet and David that contained every piece of documentation I'd gathered. Survey reports, photographs, plat records, neighbor statements, financial summaries, CC&R texts, board minutes, and the certified mail receipts going back to my first letter. It was 47 files. I also did something practical and unrelated to the lawsuit. I called the City of Columbus's planning office and pulled the permit history for Sandra's property. Permits for her back patio, her garden wall, her irrigation system, and her gate entrance. All filed and approved through the HOA as required, but the city had copies of everything. One permit stood out. In 2021, Sandra had permitted a new entrance gate on the east side of her corner lot. A brick pillar gate with a code keypad, decorative iron, the whole thing. It had been approved by the HOA board, meaning by herself. The permit listed the gate's position, and the position was noted against the plat survey. I pulled the original plat. I pulled the permit. I pulled the city's required setback for corner lot gate structures in a residential planned community. Then I measured. Then I measured again. Sandra's gate entrance, the beautiful, brick pillar, code-locked gate she'd installed in 2021, was positioned in violation of the city's corner lot visibility triangle ordinance. It wasn't a HOA violation this time. It was a city code violation, which meant it was enforced by the city, not by Sandra, and which meant I could report it to a body she had absolutely no control over. I sat with that for a moment and let the feeling settle before I called Janet. Janet laughed. Not a polite laugh, a genuine, caught-off-guard laugh. She said, "You found it, didn't you?" I said I wasn't sure what she meant. She said, "The thing that ends her." I said I thought it might be. She said sit on it until the timing was right. I said I already planned to. The calm ended on a Wednesday. I got home from picking up Theo from school to find a notice taped to my front door. Not mailed, physically taped, the kind of notice that's meant to be seen by passersby. It was a formal HOA warning for fence non-compliance and property line misrepresentation. Sandra was calling my fence non-compliant. The fence sheet had moved. The fence the court was already litigating. She was doubling down publicly in writing on my door, where my kids and my neighbors could see it. I photographed it, peeled it off, texted a picture to Janet, and started dinner. Janet called back at 7 p.m. She said Sandra's attorney had also filed a countersuit, a defamation claim against me personally, alleging that my written communications to neighbors about the financial records had constituted false statements damaging to Sandra's reputation. It was aggressive and, Janet said, probably baseless, but it meant I now had two legal fronts. The defamation claim was designed to scare me into silence. If I stopped talking to neighbors, stopped building the coalition of people with stories about Bellworth Property Services and mandatory vendor referrals, Sandra's financial case would weaken significantly. She needed me isolated and scared. She needed me to feel like talking was dangerous. I was not scared. I was focused. I called Carolyn, Dale, then Gwyn's, and 4 other neighbors who'd given me accounts of their interactions with Sandra, and I told each of them about the defamation suit. I was honest. It might make things harder, and they should feel free to step back if they were uncomfortable. Not one of them stepped back. Dale said, "She's been running this neighborhood like a toll booth. I want to be there when someone finally closes the road." I wrote that down. Not for the lawsuit, just because it was exactly right. The following week, Sandra made her first real mistake in a long time. She posted in the neighborhood Facebook group, the one she created, with 43 members she mostly controlled, a long update about HOA property integrity proceedings against a resident who had refused to cooperate with standard community guidelines. She didn't name me. She didn't have to. Everyone on Cresthaven knew who she meant. But in writing it publicly, in a forum with 43 members including several she didn't know well, she'd framed me as a bad faith actor in a community dispute. And framing is a double-edged thing. 3 people outside our immediate street saw that post. One of them was a woman named Patricia Elwood, who'd lived in Maplewood Glen for 15 years, since before Sandra, and who had no idea any of this was happening. She called me directly. She said she thought it was time someone explained to her what was really going on. I met Patricia for coffee. I brought a 2-page summary, no legalese, just a plain English timeline. I showed her the plat documents, the financial summary, and the neighbor statements, which I'd made anonymous. Patricia read everything carefully. Then she said, "Sandra blocked my daughter's patio variance in 2020 and told her it was because of a drainage study. There was never a drainage study." Patricia Elwood's daughter, Nina, lived 4 houses from me. I hadn't spoken to her about any of this. I called her that afternoon. Nina confirmed Sandra had cited a non-existent drainage study to deny a patio variance, then suggested that using Bellworth Property Services for Nina's landscaping might help move things along. Nina had paid them $800. The patio variance was approved 2 months later. That was not a corrupt suggestion. That was an explicit quid pro quo. Pay Sandra's company, get your permit. Nina had been afraid to report it because she didn't think anyone would believe her. Now she had company. Now she had documentation. Now she had Janet Chu's phone number. I added Nina's account to the shared folder. David Sue reviewed it and said it was consistent with a pattern of coercive referrals tied to permit approvals. He'd been able to cross-reference the timing of Bellworth payments with board approval actions in the partial financial records, and the correlation was statistically impossible to explain by coincidence. Janet filed an amended complaint adding the financial misconduct pattern as a component of the broader HOA abuse claim. She also formally referred the matter to the Ohio Attorney General's office with a supporting brief. I got a confirmation email from the AG's office within 48 hours. The intake specialist said they were reviewing the matter. Sandra must have found out about the AG referral because the defamation suit suddenly got more aggressive. Her attorney filed for a preliminary injunction against me, asking the court to prohibit me from discussing the HOA's financial matters with community members pending the litigation. It was an attempt to gag me using the lawsuit as the mechanism. Janet filed our opposition the same day and called it what it was in her brief: prior restraint against a private citizen discussing a matter of public concern in an HOA governed by state law. She cited 3 Ohio appellate cases. The injunction was denied by the judge within a week. Sandra had spent money on a motion that failed in 8 days. I know this because our court filings are public record, and I checked. I checked because I wanted to understand how much Sandra was spending on this, and what she was spending it with. The HOA has an attorney on retainer. That attorney's fees come from HOA dues. She was funding her personal legal war against me with community money. I raised that point formally. Janet sent a letter to all 5 board members noting that the use of HOA legal retainer funds to pursue personal defamation claims and property disputes on behalf of the president was an improper use of association funds and a breach of fiduciary duty by the board members who authorized it. Philip, the retired dentist who'd been doing Sandra's bidding for 3 years, responded to that letter, not through an attorney personally, by email to Janet. He said he wanted to discuss the situation. Janet said she'd speak to him. I waited. What Philip told Janet in a phone call 3 days later was that he hadn't understood what he'd been approving. He thought the Bellworth payments were for legitimate landscaping. He'd trusted Sandra's representations. He'd voted with her because he thought she knew what she was doing and because she made it very clear that opposing her made your HOA life difficult. Philip said he'd voted for the special session fence resolution because Sandra told him it was necessary for community integrity and that the legal basis had already been reviewed. He hadn't asked for the review. He'd taken her word. He was 81 years old and tired and wanted this to be over. Janet asked Philip if he'd be willing to put what he'd told her in a sworn statement. He said he'd think about it. She sent him a written summary of their conversation for his review. She was careful, thorough, and patient with him. I was grateful for her. This was the work that didn't make for dramatic moments but built the actual case. Greta was harder. Greta had known Sandra for 11 years and had vacationed with her. When Janet reached out to Greta, Greta's response was a terse email saying she had nothing to add and would be consulting her own attorney. Sandra had gotten to her first. Meanwhile, Sandra escalated the Facebook campaign. She posted community investment updates with before and after photos of landscaping projects. Projects paid for with HOA money, funneled through Bellworth, presented now as evidence of her good stewardship. She was building her defense in public before the case went to court. I didn't engage in the Facebook group. I watched and saved screenshots. I noted which projects she claimed as improvements. David Sue cross-referenced 2 of them against the partial financial records and found that one, seasonal enhancement project, billed at $11,400, appeared to correspond to basic lawn maintenance that the previous landscaping contractor had charged $2,800 for. That gap, $8,600, one project, 1 year, was the clearest example of what we were dealing with. Sandra wasn't just steering business to Bellworth. She was approving inflated invoices. The HOA was paying 4 times market rate for services, and the difference was going somewhere. David needed the full bank records to trace where. The court hearing on the motion to compel financial disclosure was now 3 weeks away. Sandra's attorney had responded to the motion with a filing that argued the financial records were HOA proprietary information, exempt from member inspection, an argument Janet described as both creative and wrong. The night before the hearing, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Greta called me. Not Sandra, not Janet, me directly on my cell phone. She'd gotten the number from the community directory. It was 9:30 p.m. and her voice was quiet and careful. She said she'd been reading the court filings. She could access them as a board member, and she'd seen the evidence summary Janet had attached to the motion to compel. She said she wanted me to know that she'd never been told Bellworth Property Services had any connection to Douglas Pratt or to Sandra's personal finances. She'd voted for those payments believing they were arm's-length vendor contracts. She sounded genuinely shaken. I was careful. I asked if she'd be comfortable speaking to Janet. She said she didn't know. She said she needed to think. I thanked her for calling and told her that whatever she decided, I respected it. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long moment. Marcus came in and I told him about the call. He said, "She's scared." I said I knew. He said, "If she flips, Sandra loses her board majority." I said I knew that too. We didn't say what we were both thinking. That Greta calling me at 9:30 p.m. was either the beginning of something or a test, and we wouldn't know which until the hearing. The hearing went in our favor. The judge reviewed Sandra's attorney's argument about proprietary exemption and said, flatly, that Ohio law was clear. HOA financial records are member accessible. Full stop. She ordered full disclosure of all records, all invoices, all bank statements, for the preceding 4 years, within 15 days. Sandra's attorney asked for 30. The judge said 15. Sandra was in the courtroom. I saw her face when the judge said 15 days. It was the first time I'd seen her expression break. Not into anger or tears, but into something that looked like the rapid recalculation of a person who's suddenly run out of moves in the direction they've been moving. I didn't look at her long. I looked at my hands, then at Janet, who gave me a small nod. We didn't celebrate in the hallway. We went to a coffee shop around the corner, ordered plain drip coffee, and talked through the next steps quietly. There were many next steps. The 15-day countdown began. Sandra's attorney filed a motion for reconsideration the next morning. A routine attempt to delay. It was denied 3 days later. The clock kept running. I kept working. I sent Janet 2 more neighbor accounts. A couple on Birchwood who'd been pressured into Bellworth Services before a fence variance. And a woman named Sheila who said Sandra had directly told her that new homeowners are expected to support HOA vendors. Sheila had screenshots, texts from Sandra. Direct, explicit texts saying that cooperation with recommended vendors was part of being a good neighbor in Maplewood Glen. Not a rule, not a bylaw, a social threat. Sheila had saved them because she'd felt uncomfortable and couldn't explain why. Now she could explain exactly why. Janet added Sheila's screenshots to the exhibit file. 11 neighbors, 9 confirmed Bellworth payments, text evidence of coercion, financial records comparison showing inflated invoicing, and a forensic accountant ready to testify. We were no longer building a case. We were finishing one. 5 days before the financial records were due, Sandra did something that surprised me. She resigned as HOA president. A 1-line email to the board and the HOA attorney. No explanation, no letter to the community. Just, I am resigning effective immediately. I wish Maplewood Glen well. I read it twice. Then I called Janet. Janet said, "Don't celebrate. This is a move, not a retreat." I asked what she meant. She said resigned HOA officers sometimes argue reduced liability for decisions made in their official capacity, as if stepping down erased the record of what they'd approved. It doesn't. But it was an attempt. The Facebook group went quiet. Sandra stopped posting. The neighborhood buzzed with confusion and speculation. People who'd had no idea what was happening were now piecing it together from Sandra's sudden disappearance from the community narrative she'd been carefully curating for 3 years. Patricia Elwood posted in the Facebook group asking what was happening. 3 people replied that they didn't know. Carolyn Marsh replied that the HOA leadership had been under legal review and that more information would be available soon. Sandra did not reply. 2 days after Sandra's resignation, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Douglas Pratt. He introduced himself, and before I could say anything, he said he wanted to talk. I said he needed to contact my attorney. He said he didn't want to do this through attorneys. I said that wasn't my preference or my problem, and I gave him Janet's number and hung up. Janet told me he'd called her within the hour. He wanted to discuss a cooperative arrangement. Janet said she was listening. He said he was willing to provide documentation of his financial relationship with Sandra, the actual structure of Bellworth Property Services, who received the distributions, how much and when, in exchange for not being named in the civil suit. Janet called me immediately after and said, "He's going to hand us Sandra on a plate." I said, "Do it." She said she needed to think about the terms carefully. What we agreed to release him from couldn't undermine the AG investigation or the court case, but we might be able to structure something. I told her I trusted her judgment. I meant it. Douglas Pratt was not Sandra's partner in the way I'd imagined. He wasn't a financial equal or a co-architect of the scheme. He was a man Sandra had used. He'd registered Bellworth as a favor to her, provided the professional face, taken a 10% cut, and handed the rest to Sandra through a series of personal consulting fees she'd invoiced to the company for community relations services. Sandra had been billing her own HOA-connected company for fake consulting work and collecting the cash. Douglas had the invoices. He had the bank records. He had 3 years of transfers from Bellworth's account to a personal account in Sandra Bellworth's name. He'd kept records because he was not, at heart, brave, but he was careful. Janet structured a cooperation agreement that preserved the AG investigation and the civil claims. Douglas Pratt was not going to walk away clean, but he was going to walk away from the civil suit. What he gave us in return was a complete financial picture of what Sandra had done, and it was worse than we'd estimated. Total improper payments from the HOA Treasury to Bellworth Property Services over 3 years, $93,400. Total personal payments from Bellworth to Sandra's account, documented, $71,800. That's nearly $72,000 that Sandra Bellworth had extracted from the Maplewood Glen HOA, from her neighbors over 3 years. For context, the HOA's annual budget was around $180,000. Sandra had taken roughly 40% of 1 year's total budget for herself over 3 years. The real landscaping work, the legitimate portion, had been done by subcontractors Bellworth hired at low rates while billing the HOA at premium rates. The gap was Sandra's. David Sue certified all of it. He wrote a 15-page forensic accounting report with exhibits. It was a document I read 3 times at the kitchen table, not because it was complicated, it was actually very clear, but because I kept thinking about the Ngwins, about Carolyn, about Sheila and her screenshots, about Dale who called it a toll booth. All those people had been paying dues in good faith for 3 years. Their money had gone to Sandra. Their money had funded her landscaping, her gate, probably her pearls. They deserved to know. They were going to know. The financial records Sandra was required to produce by court order arrived on the 14th day, 1 day before the deadline. They were complete. Her attorney had apparently understood that obstruction at this point would be catastrophic. David Sue spent 3 days going through them and confirmed every finding. I spent those 3 days preparing for the next phase, because the financial case was nearly complete, but there was still the fence. My original fence, still sitting 6 feet inside my property line, still wrong, still unpunished, and I hadn't forgotten about Sandra's gate. I'd been holding the city code violation for the right moment. That moment was approaching. The gate violated the corner lot visibility triangle ordinance, a safety regulation, not an aesthetic one, enforced by the city's planning and zoning department. I could file a complaint any time, but I wanted it to land in a specific sequence. Janet and I talked through the timeline. The civil trial on the fence was set for 6 weeks out. The AG investigation was ongoing. The financial records were now in David's hands. The court had the cooperation agreement from Pratt. The neighbor statements were filed as exhibits. Everything was positioned. I wanted the city code complaint to be the last move before the public trial, the one that Sandra couldn't prepare for, couldn't charm away, couldn't route through the HOA board she no longer controlled. I wanted it filed when she'd already lost the board, already resigned, already been exposed in the financial record. I wanted it to be the final piece of her power she lost. The twist I didn't see coming was that I didn't have to wait as long as I'd planned. Because Sandra, cornered and losing, made the worst decision she'd made in the entire conflict. She stopped being strategic and got personal. And personal was the one mistake that accelerated everything. On a Saturday morning, 3 weeks before the civil trial, I found my daughter's bike in the front yard, which I'd left there the night before, with the tires slashed. Both tires clean cuts, not accidental. Deja had ridden it to school on Friday. It was a purple Specialized hybrid that Marcus and I had gotten her for her birthday, and she loved it more than almost anything she owned. I stood in the driveway holding the bike, and I felt something I'd been working very hard not to feel for months. I felt fury. Not the cold, focused kind I'd been carrying, the hot kind. The kind that makes you want to do something fast and satisfying instead of slow and effective. I stood there and I breathed and I called Janet. Janet said to document it and call the police. I did both. The Columbus police officer who came out was professional and thorough. He photographed the tires, the clean cuts, the driveway surface for footwear impressions, and took a report. He said vandalism on private property was a misdemeanor at minimum and could escalate to criminal mischief depending on circumstances. I had a security camera on the garage. Marcus had installed it 2 months earlier at my request. I told him then I wanted documentation of anything that happened near our property, and he'd done it without asking why, which I appreciated. The camera covered the driveway and the front sidewalk. The footage showed Sandra Bellworth at 2:47 a.m. She was wearing dark clothes and moving quickly, but the camera's low-light capability was good, and her face was visible for 3 full seconds as she crossed under the motion-activated porch light. She knelt by the bike. She had something in her hand. She was gone in 40 seconds. I watched that footage 4 times. Then I called the officer back and told him I had video. He came back within the hour. He watched it on Marcus's laptop in our kitchen and said, very simply, "That's your neighbor?" I said yes. He said he'd submit the footage with the report and someone would follow up. The follow-up came faster than I expected. A detective from the Columbus PD called me Monday morning. She introduced herself as Detective Angela Harmon. She'd reviewed the footage, the police report, and the incident context I'd provided, including the civil litigation, the HOA dispute, and Sandra's recent resignation. She had questions for me. Then she had questions for Sandra. I don't know exactly what Sandra said to Detective Harmon, because I wasn't there. What I know is that Sandra was not arrested that day, but she was interviewed on the record, and she did not deny being in the area. She claimed she'd been taking a walk at 3 a.m. in dark clothes, with something in her hand. Detective Harmon called me back after the interview. She said the matter was referred to the county prosecutor's office. She said I should hear something within 2 to 3 weeks. She also said, with carefully chosen words, that she'd done some background reading on the HOA situation and that I appeared to have been thorough in documenting things. I took that as a professional compliment. Sandra knew we had footage. She knew because her attorney called Janet the next morning and said Sandra wanted to discuss a global settlement, meaning everything. The fence, the financial claims, the civil suit, all of it in one package. Janet said we'd hear their proposal and evaluate it. She did not sound enthusiastic about a settlement. I told Janet I didn't want a quiet settlement. I understood that was a complicated position legally and financially, but I had specific reasons. The neighbors who'd been harmed, Carolyn, Nina, Dale, Sheila, the Nguyen's, Patricia's daughter, they deserved a public record. A private settlement would let Sandra pay a number and disappear without anyone knowing why. Janet said she understood but wanted me to hear the proposal before deciding. The proposal came through. Sandra offered to restore the fence to its original position, pay our full legal fees, make a payment to a community fund she proposed creating, and step back from all HOA involvement permanently. In exchange, a full release of all civil claims and a confidentiality agreement. The confidentiality agreement was the tell. She didn't mind paying. She minded being known. 3 years of carefully managed reputation, the Facebook group, the community updates, the pearl-wearing authority, and she was willing to pay 6 figures to keep that reputation intact. I read the confidentiality clause twice and said no. Janet sent back a counter. We'd consider settling the fence case and the property damage claim, but the financial misconduct was now partly in the hands of the AG's office and could not be confidentially settled by us. Only the civil component, and we would not sign any document that prohibited us from discussing our own experience in our own neighborhood with our own neighbors. Sandra's attorney came back within 48 hours and rejected the counter. They wanted full confidentiality or no deal. We were going to trial. I was at peace with that. The next 2 weeks were the densest of the whole ordeal. Janet prepared the trial package. David Sue finalized his expert report. The neighbor witnesses confirmed their availability. Patricia Elwood, who'd become quietly central to everything, organized a meeting of 12 Maplewood Glen residents who'd asked to understand what was happening. She held it in her living room. I attended that meeting. I brought the 2-page plain English summary I'd made for Patricia and updated it. I walked the room through the timeline, from the fence removal to the financial investigation to the criminal referral, and I answered questions for an hour. Nobody seemed shocked that it had happened. Several people said they'd always felt something was off. One man in the back, older, retired, who'd been in the neighborhood since it was built, said, "I always thought the landscaping bills seemed high." He looked embarrassed not to have said something sooner. I told him that was Sandra's whole system. Keep every individual piece just under the threshold where someone would act. The meeting ended with a consensus. Whatever happened at trial, people wanted to know about it. They were tired of the information being managed by someone who benefited from managing it. The neighborhood Facebook group Sandra had built was already changing. People were posting without her filter, and the tone was noticeably different. 3 days before trial, the Ohio AG's office called Janet. They'd completed their preliminary review and were initiating a formal investigation into potential fraud and breach of fiduciary duty by the Maplewood Glen HOA leadership. The investigation would run parallel to our civil trial. They were not waiting. Sandra's attorney called that afternoon asking if we'd reconsider the settlement, given the AG development. Janet said we would not. We had one more card to play, and I'd been holding it for 2 months. The city code complaint about Sandra's gate. I filed it that afternoon online through the Columbus Department of Building and Zoning Services with a full written description, the plat documents, the permit filing, and the measured discrepancy. The city assigned a case number within an hour. An inspector was scheduled within 5 business days. Sandra's gate, her beautiful, brick pillar, code-locked entrance gate that she'd had installed in 2021 and approved herself as HOA president, sat in violation of the corner lot visibility triangle ordinance. The city would require it to be modified or removed. She could not appeal to the HOA board. She could not call a special session. She could not send me a notice. 2 days before trial, Greta called Janet. She'd made a decision. She would provide a sworn statement. She said she hadn't known about the Bellworth financial arrangement and that if she had, she wouldn't have voted for those payments. She said she'd been afraid of Sandra for years and she was done with that. Janet thanked her carefully and got everything in writing. The night before trial, Marcus made the chicken stew again. The kids were asleep by 8:30. We sat at the kitchen table and I looked at my Sandra file, now 6 inches thick and spanning 4 years of this neighborhood's life, and I thought about how none of it should have been necessary. A fence, moved 6 feet. That's how it started. Sandra had probably assumed I'd be like everyone else. Overwhelmed, confused, worried about legal costs, eventually worn down enough to let it go. She'd run that play for 3 years. It worked on people who didn't know the rules, who didn't have the time, who were afraid of her. She'd misjudged me on all 3 counts. I wasn't afraid of her. I was a civil engineer who read HOA documents for fun, and I had 4 years of receipts. The morning of the trial, I wore my good navy blazer and flat shoes. I'd learned from watching other people testify that comfort matters as much as appearance. Marcus drove me. The kids were at school. We didn't say much. At one point in the car, he reached over and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, and that was enough. The Franklin County Courthouse is a solid building, limestone and glass, the kind of architecture that's meant to suggest permanence and fairness. I'd been in it twice before, both times briefly. This time I was going to be there all day, maybe 2 days. Janet had prepared me for both. Sandra was already in the courtroom when we arrived. She was in a charcoal suit, pearls, hair pinned back. She looked composed. She was looking at documents on the table and not at the door when I came in. Her attorney was next to her and he also didn't look up. They were either very calm or very good at performing calm. I sat at the plaintiff's table. I felt Janet's hand on my shoulder for a moment. I opened my notebook. I had notes on every witness, every exhibit, every expected argument from Sandra's attorney. I prepared like I was defending a dissertation. In some ways, the data, the documentation, the precision of the case were everything. Judge Patricia Wren took the bench at 9:15. She was a compact, unhurried woman who'd been on the bench for 12 years and clearly had no tolerance for theatrical lawyers. When she spoke, it was direct and quiet. The room adjusted to her register. Janet gave the opening statement. She was clear, specific, and chronological. The fence was here, the law says this, the board had no authority to move it, and the financial investigation was secondary but relevant context for understanding why Sandra was willing to act illegally. Took 11 minutes. Judge Wren did not interrupt. Sandra's attorney gave his opening statement. He argued that the HOA had authority over community standards and that the fence modification was within board discretion. He used the word discretion 9 times. He did not mention Bellworth Property Services, Douglas Pratt, or the AG investigation. He spent 4 minutes on aesthetics. Judge Wren looked at him for a moment after he finished and asked one question. Counsel, does your client dispute that the fence was moved without a membership vote as required by the Ohio Planned Community Act? He said the board had an emergency provision. She said that wasn't what she asked. I watched Sandra at that moment. She was writing on a notepad and she didn't look up. But her pen stopped moving. The first witness was the surveyor, Thomas Radke, who'd done our post-removal survey. He was precise and direct. The original fence position was on the legal property line. The new fence position was 6 feet, 2 inches inside the legal property line. The land in between was the plaintiff's property. Cross-examination did nothing to move those numbers. The second witness was David Sue. He was on the stand for 2 hours. He walked through the financial forensics with the patience of someone who'd done this many times and knew exactly how to make numbers tell a story a layperson could follow. He talked about what HOA finances should look like, what these ones actually looked like, and what the gap between the two meant. Sandra's attorney objected repeatedly, relevance, foundation. Scope. Judge Wren overruled most of them. The ones she sustained were minor. David kept talking. The numbers kept coming. By the time he finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Philip testified. He was small and apologetic on the stand, and every answer was some version of "Sandra told me," or "I trusted that it had been reviewed," or "I didn't understand what I was signing." He wasn't lying. He was an old man who'd been used as a rubber stamp, and the testimony made that very clear, and I felt more pity than satisfaction watching him. Greta testified. Her statement was the most damaging, because she was Sandra's friend and she said it plainly. She had never been told about the Bellworth financial relationship. She would not have approved the payments if she had known. She looked once at Sandra while she was saying it. Sandra did not look back. Then it was Sandra's turn. She took the stand in the afternoon after lunch, when the room was a little warm and the day had the accumulated weight of 5 hours of testimony. Her attorney walked her through her version. She'd acted in good faith. The board had authority. The fence modification was a community standard decision. The Bellworth payments were for legitimate services. She was composed. She was articulate. She had practiced. She gave specific answers to specific questions, and she maintained eye contact with the jury. There was no jury, it was a bench trial. She was maintaining eye contact with the judge, which was actually the right call. She was good. I'd always known she was good at this part. Then Janet stood up for cross-examination, and everything changed. She didn't start with the fence. She started with Bellworth Property Services. She asked Sandra when she'd first learned of the company. Sandra said she'd been introduced to it by a community contact. Janet asked for the name of the contact. Sandra said she didn't recall. Janet asked if Sandra was aware that Bellworth Property Services was co-registered by Douglas Pratt, whom Sandra had introduced to the HOA board as a community development consultant in January. Sandra said she was aware of Douglas Pratt's professional role. Janet asked if she was aware that Douglas Pratt was a financial beneficiary of Bellworth contracts. Sandra said she didn't have specific knowledge of his compensation structure. Janet put Exhibit 34 on the screen. It was a text message from Sandra's phone number to Douglas Pratt's phone number, dated 8 months earlier. Greenline is asking questions. Just make sure the Q3 invoices go out before the 15th and I'll approve on the 20th. Keep the description vague. Sandra looked at the exhibit. She said nothing. Her attorney said, "Objection, foundation." Judge Wren said, "Overruled." Ms. Bellworth, do you recognize the phone number in this text? Sandra said it was her number. Judge Wren said, "Proceed, counselor." Janet proceeded. She put Exhibit 35 on the screen. A Bellworth invoice dated 4 days after that text, for $8,200, described as property aesthetic services. She put Exhibit 36 next to it. The HOA bank statement showing the payment approved by Sandra on the 20th, exactly as she texted. Then she put Exhibit 37, a transfer from Bellworth's account to a personal account in Sandra Bellworth's name for $6,400, 78% of the invoice, 8 days after the HOA paid. Janet stood quietly for a moment and let the room look at all 3 exhibits on the screen together. Then she said, "Mrs. Bellworth, can you explain this sequence?" Sandra said she needed to consult her attorney. Judge Wren said she could take a brief recess, but that a witness who'd chosen to testify was expected to answer questions. Sandra said she didn't recall the specific transactions. Janet moved to the fence. She put the survey documents on the screen. She asked Sandra to confirm she'd been served with Janet's original certified letter disputing the legal authority of the setback modification. Sandra confirmed it. Janet asked if she'd responded. Sandra said the HOA had responded through counsel. Janet showed the HOA attorney's response, which had not addressed the supermajority requirement. Janet asked Sandra to identify the specific provision in the CC and RS authorizing the board to modify existing fence positions without a membership vote in a non-emergency situation. Sandra asked for the document. Janet provided it. Sandra looked at it for a long time. Her attorney leaned over and said something. Sandra said, "The board has general community standards authority." Judge Wren spoke, which she rarely had during cross-examination. She said, "Mrs. Bellworth, the question was about a specific provision. If no such provision exists, you may say so." There was a long pause. Sandra said, "I believed we had the authority." The judge made a note. Janet moved on. Janet showed the security camera footage on the courtroom display screen. She moved through it frame by frame. Sandra in dark clothing at 2:47 a.m. Sandra moving down our driveway. Sandra kneeling beside Deja's bike. Sandra standing and walking away. The footage was 38 seconds long. The courtroom was completely silent. Janet asked, "Mrs. Bellworth, is this you in this footage?" Sandra's attorney said, "Objection." Judge Wren said, "On what grounds?" There was a pause. He said, "Relevance to the current proceeding." Judge Wren said the vandalism of the plaintiff's property during active litigation was relevant to the question of damages and bad faith. The objection was overruled. Sandra said she could not confirm her identity in the footage. Janet said the Columbus PD had submitted a forensic enhancement of 3 frames showing Sandra's face clearly, and she had Detective Harmon's report identifying Sandra as the individual in the footage based on facial comparison. She put it on the screen. Sandra looked at her hands. She didn't look at the screen. Her composure, the composed Sandra who'd been performing calm for 6 hours in a courtroom, was visibly cracking. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her in a way that looked like she was pressing them down to keep them still. Janet said she had no further questions. Sandra's attorney stood to redirect and asked Sandra if she felt she'd always acted in the best interests of the Maplewood Glen community. Sandra said yes. He asked if she'd ever knowingly acted outside her authority as HOA president. She said, "I believe I acted within the scope of my role." He said he had no further questions. Judge Wren called a recess. I sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at my notebook. Marcus was in the gallery. He'd taken the afternoon off. I didn't turn around. I looked at the notes and I thought about the first morning, standing on the smaller driveway, holding that piece of paper Sandra had handed me, looking at the freshly laid sod. 3 minutes into the recess, Sandra's attorney came to Janet's table. He said Sandra wanted to discuss settlement. Right now. During the recess, Janet looked at me. I said no. I said we were going to finish the day. He said the terms might be very favorable. I said I'm sure they would be. We finished the day. Janet delivered closing argument the next morning. It was 18 minutes long and she didn't use a single rhetorical flourish. Just evidence sequenced precisely. The fence movement violated Ohio property law. The board lacked authority. The financial records demonstrated a 3-year pattern of self-dealing. The vandalism demonstrated bad faith in the ongoing dispute. She asked for full restoration, full damages, and a declaratory finding that the HOA board had acted outside its legal authority. Sandra's attorney gave a 25-minute closing that was heavy on community spirit and light on law. He used the word discretion 7 more times. Judge Wren listened with her customary stillness and took notes. Judge Wren said she'd have a written decision within 14 days. 14 days. That was the compression point. 2 weeks of waiting after 2 months of everything else. Sandra and her attorney left without making eye contact with anyone. Marcus found me in the hallway and put his arm around me and we walked out into the October morning. The 14 days were quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The difference matters. Quiet is what happens when the thing you've been working toward is in someone else's hands and there's nothing left to do but wait. I went back to work. I took Deja to the bike shop and got her tires replaced, new ones, better ones. I upgraded the whole wheel set. She didn't ask why we were replacing them. I hadn't told her about the vandalism. The AG investigation continued in the background. An investigator had called Janet twice for additional documentation, and she'd provided it. We had no timeline on that process, but it was moving. The city inspector had visited Sandra's property during the trial week and confirmed the gate violation. Sandra had been given 60 days to bring it into compliance. The Maplewood Glen HOA had elected an interim president at an emergency membership meeting. A woman named Carrie Tran from Birchwood Drive, who'd been a resident for 6 years and wanted the job because, as she told the room plainly, someone with a straightforward motivation had to do it. She was well organized and had no relationship with Douglas Pratt. On day 12, Janet called. She said Judge Wren had released her written decision early. I asked if that was good or bad. Janet said, "Read it yourself. I'm sending it now." And her voice was warm in a way that told me what I needed to know before I opened the email. The decision was 41 pages. I read the whole thing. Judge Wren found for the plaintiff on all counts. Fence restoration ordered, full legal fees awarded, compensatory damages of $22,400 for the cost of the surveys, the forensic accounting and property damage including the vandalism. She also issued a declaratory judgment finding that the HOA board's special session resolution was procedurally void and of no legal effect. On the financial misconduct claims, Judge Wren noted that the civil fraud elements had been adequately established by the evidence, but that the ongoing AG investigation took precedence for criminal and regulatory accountability. She ordered Sandra personally liable for the legal fee award and found that the use of HOA funds to pursue the defamation claim against me was an improper use of fiduciary resources. She noted, specifically in paragraph 19 of the decision, that the security camera evidence of the bicycle vandalism during active litigation constituted strong circumstantial evidence of willful bad faith, and she cited it as justification for the enhanced damages award. The paragraph about Deja's bike was 3 sentences long. I read those 3 sentences 4 times. I forwarded the decision to Marcus. He called me back in 4 minutes and said, "Rachel." That was all. Just my name and the way he said it. Then he said, "Do you want to go to dinner?" I said yes. We went to the Italian place on High Street where we'd celebrated our 10-year anniversary. We ordered the expensive wine. It was a Tuesday. The next morning I went outside with a cup of coffee and stood on my driveway and looked at my fence. Still in the wrong position because the physical restoration work was a separate process from the legal decision, typically taking a few weeks to schedule and execute. The fence would be moved back. I had the court order. I had the survey. I knew exactly where the line was. I looked at Sandra's house. The lights were on. Her car was in the driveway. The beautiful brick pillar gate on the east side of her corner lot was still there, but there was a city notice on it, a compliance order in a bright orange envelope. She had 60 days. After 60 days, the city would cite her and eventually require removal. The gate that she'd approved for herself while being the only one who could approve it. The gate that sat in violation of a safety ordinance. The gate I'd found by pulling public records from the city in the same way she'd pulled rules from the CC and RS to make my life difficult. The gate that was going to come down not because of anything I did directly but because the law is the law and she'd broken it and I'd simply pointed at the brake. I thought about what she'd done and why. I think she'd moved my fence not just because she wanted the land, though she did want the land, but because she'd been doing things like that for 3 years and nobody had ever stopped her. She'd learned that people fold. She'd learned that patience, authority, and paperwork wore people down. She'd learned that confidence reads as legitimacy. She'd misjudged me specifically and systematically. She'd misjudged my professional competence, my patience, my documentation habits, and my willingness to spend money on lawyers and accountants. She'd also misjudged something less tangible, how much it matters to some people to be right. Not righteous, just right. Factually, provably, irrevocably right. Marcus came outside and stood next to me with his own coffee. We looked at the fence and the gate and the quiet street in the October morning. He said, "You know you saved money for like 40 of these neighbors." I said, "I know." He said, "They should send you a card." I said, "They should just pay their dues on time." He laughed. We went inside. The fence was physically moved back 11 days after the court decision, on a Thursday morning. I'd hired a licensed fencing contractor, not Greenline, not anyone Sandra had ever touched, and they did the work in 4 hours. I watched from the garage. I photographed every step. When they finished, my yard was my yard again, exactly as the survey said it should be. The strip of land, 1,240 square feet of my property that had been under Sandra's sod for 6 months, looked pale and pressed where her grass had been. My contractor removed the intrusive sod and reseeded it. It would take a full season to look normal. Some things take a season. That's all right. Sandra came out of her house while the fence was being moved. She stood at her door for about a minute, watching, then went back inside. She didn't say anything. She didn't send anyone over. The contractor's crew chief, who'd been briefed on the situation, told me later that he could see her through her front window watching as they set the posts back on the original line. The same afternoon, the AG's office issued a press release. They don't normally issue press releases for HOA investigations. This was not a normal HOA investigation. The release stated that the office was initiating formal action against Sandra Bellworth, former president of the Maplewood Glen Homeowners Association, for alleged misappropriation of community funds and breach of fiduciary duty totaling in excess of $90,000. The Columbus Dispatch covered it. Then the local ABC affiliate. Then a regional news aggregator picked up the story and it spread from there. By Friday morning, the Facebook group Sandra had created, Maplewood Glen Community Updates, had 247 comments on Patricia Elwood's post linking to the Dispatch article. Sandra had not posted in the group for 3 weeks. I did not post in the Facebook group about any of it. I let it be covered by the news. I let my neighbors read and react without my voice in it. I was done curating this story. The documents and the court decision and the AG press release told it well enough without me. The neighborhood meeting that Carrie Tran organized 2 weeks later drew 31 residents. The largest HOA meeting in Maplewood Glen's history, according to Patricia, who'd been coming since the mid-aughts. Carrie walked through the court decision, the AG investigation status, the financial picture, and the plan for auditing and restoring the HOA treasury. I attended but didn't speak until someone asked me to. When I did, I kept it brief. Here's what I found, here's what I did. Here's the law that makes it possible for any homeowner to do the same thing. I recommended that every person in the room read their CC and RS at least once. Several people laughed. Several people looked like they were already doing it mentally. Dale was in the back of the room. He caught my eye and gave me a nod. A single specific nod that said everything he couldn't easily say out loud. I nodded back. The Nguyen's were in the middle of the room, and when it was over, Mrs. Nguyen hugged me in the parking lot and said, "You did this for all of us." I said I did it for my fence. She hugged me harder. The Columbus PD completed their investigation of the bicycle vandalism 4 weeks after the trial. The county prosecutor's office filed a criminal complaint against Sandra Bellworth for criminal mischief and criminal damaging under Ohio Revised Code Section 2909.05. These are misdemeanor charges at the base level, but the prosecutor cited the targeted nature of the act, committed during active civil litigation against the same victim, as an aggravating factor. Sandra's attorney entered a not guilty plea. A hearing was set. In the meantime, Sandra was still living in her corner lot home with the beautiful garden and the gate with the orange compliance notice still attached to it. She had 51 days left on the city's modification order. The AG's formal charges were filed 6 weeks after the press release. Criminal charges, not just civil ones. Ohio treats HOA financial misappropriation as theft when the amounts reach a certain threshold. $93,000 exceeded that threshold. Sandra was charged with theft by deception and misuse of fiduciary funds. These are felony-level charges. I read the charge documents when they were filed publicly. They were specific, itemized, and damning. They cited Douglas Pratt's cooperation agreement as a primary evidentiary basis, along with David Seuss' forensic report. Every single number we'd found in the partial records was in there, now with the complete bank statements to back it up. I forwarded the link to Janet with no message. She responded with a single word, "Yes." I sent the same link to Marcus. He called and said, "She's really going to face criminal charges." I said yes. He was quiet a moment and said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said I felt tired and correct. He said that sounded right. The gate came down 48 days into the 60-day compliance period. I was working from home when I heard equipment outside. I looked out the window. A crew was removing the brick pillars, the ironwork, the keypad, all of it. Took 3 hours. When they were done, Sandra's corner lot had an open curb cut where the gate had been. No barrier, no enclosure, just the street and the sidewalk and the ordinary boundary of someone's yard. I watched from my window without going outside. There was nothing I needed to say. The gate was coming down because of a city ordinance that predated both of us, applied equally to everyone, and had been violated by someone who'd spent 3 years deciding that rules applied to other people more than they applied to her. Deja asked me that evening why Sandra's gate was gone. I said there had been a rule about where gates could be on corner lots and Sandra's gate was in the wrong place. Deja said, "Why did she put it in the wrong place if it was against the rules?" I said sometimes people think the rules don't apply to them. Deja thought about that and said, "That's really dumb." I said, "It really is." The HOA financial audit that Carrie Tran commissioned, using an independent CPA firm, publicly selected by membership vote, which was very much on purpose, found total discrepancies of $103,200 over Sandra's 3-year tenure. The additional $10,000 beyond what we'd identified came from a community event fund that had been used for what appeared to be personal catering expenses. The audit report was shared with all HOA members at a general meeting. Every person in the room could see the line items, the before and after, the Sandra era, and what it cost. Carrie proposed a dues assessment to partially restore the Treasury over 2 years. The vote was 37-2 in favor. For once, the HOA operated exactly the way it was supposed to. Sandra's criminal trial on the financial charges was set for the following spring. Her trial on the vandalism charge was set separately in district court for January. In the meantime, she remained in her home, apparently confined in the way that public disgrace confines a person. Present but diminished, visible but no longer anyone's authority. A few people on the street still waved to her. Not many. The Facebook group she'd created continued under Carrie's stewardship and was now a genuinely useful community space. People asking about trash pickup schedules, sharing recommendations, organizing a fall cleanup. Normal. Functional. Not a vehicle for anyone's ambitions. I got a card in the mail from someone I didn't know. A Maplewood Glen resident from a section of the neighborhood I'd never visited. It said simply, "Thank you for not letting it go. Some of us needed someone who wouldn't." No return address. I put it in the Sandra file, which I'd kept because I knew it would eventually be useful to me as a record of what persistence actually looks like when it's boring and incremental and rarely satisfying in the moment. In January, Sandra pled no contest to the criminal mischief charge in the vandalism case. She received a fine and probation. She was required to pay full restitution for the cost of Deja's tires plus the enhanced damages from the civil case. In the courtroom for the plea, she spoke only to confirm she understood the charges. She did not look at me. I looked at her. I wanted to see what it looked like when someone who'd run a neighborhood like a personal fiefdom for 3 years finally had to stand in a place she couldn't control. She was still in a good suit, still well-groomed. But the pearl-wearing authority was gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, just absent. She was a person who'd done something and been caught, which is a much smaller thing than she'd been before. The financial charges took longer. Felony trials have their own rhythms, and we waited through multiple continuances and pretrial motions. In the spring, Sandra took a plea deal. Guilty to 1 count of theft by deception, misdemeanor reclassification in exchange for full restitution of $103,200 and 18 months of supervised release. She avoided prison. Barely, I thought. Full restitution to the HOA meant the money came back. Carrie Tran announced it at a membership meeting and people actually clapped. Not a Hollywood moment. More like the satisfaction of a stuck drawer finally opening. The money was back. The books were clean. The HOA could operate. Janet sent me a final billing summary and a handwritten note that said, "This was a good one. Thank you for the referrals. 4 of your neighbors have already called." I paid the bill. It was significant. It was worth every dollar, not just because of the outcome but because of what the process had required me to be. Precise, patient, thorough, unwilling to accept a settlement that prioritized my individual peace over the community's right to know. Marcus and I had a conversation eventually about whether I'd become too consumed by it. He said there were months where I was more Rachel versus Sandra than Rachel his wife, and that was real. I said he was right. I said I thought it had been worth it, but I understood that it had cost something between us that had nothing to do with lawyers or money. We talked about it a long time. We talked about the balance between fighting for something right and making the fight the whole thing. I don't think I fully got that balance right all the time, but I don't think I was wrong to fight. Those are 2 separate things, and they can both be true. The spring after everything settled, I planted a garden along my fence line, the original fence line, the legal one, mine. Deja helped me. We planted tomatoes and pole beans and a row of sunflowers that Theo picked out because he said they were the tallest flowers and he liked how they looked from the street. We put the first seeds in on a Saturday morning. The weather warm and newly cooperative. Sandra's gate space was still a plain curb cut. She hadn't replaced it with anything. The brick pillars were gone and the soil was bare. Across the strip of my yard that had been violated and restored, my fence posts stood exactly where Thomas Radke's survey said they should. Exactly. Not an inch off. I stood at the fence one evening in April, the light going orange, and I thought about the morning I'd come home and found it gone. 6 feet. It was only 6 feet. And it had taken 14 months, 1 lawsuit, 1 criminal complaint, 1 AG investigation, 1 city code violation, 1 forensic accountant, 1 attorney, 12 neighbors, 1 security camera, and a purple bicycle. But the fence was back. And so was everything else Sandra had tried to take. From me and from everyone who'd lived under her quiet coercion for 3 years. That's the thing about taking on someone who believes the rules are for other people. You have to be willing to use the rules better than they do. You have to know them better. You have to document everything and lose nothing and keep going when it's tedious and expensive and nobody's watching. I'm good at that. I didn't know I was until I had to be. 3 months after Sandra's plea deal, she put her house on the market. It sold in 11 days to a family with 3 kids, a couple about our age, Marcus's age really, who came by to introduce themselves the week they moved in. Their names were James and Vivian Chin. He was a teacher. She was in logistics. Vivian Chin introduced herself at my door on a Wednesday afternoon and said they were thrilled about the neighborhood and the Greenbelt and the school district. And she'd heard from the realtor that Maplewood Glen had a very active HOA. I said yes it did. She said, Is it well run? I said, "It is now." She smiled like she didn't fully understand the answer. "She will eventually, but probably not in the way I had to." I shook her hand and welcomed her to Cresthaven Circle and told her if she ever had questions about the HOA rules, she should ask Carrie Tran, who knew everything and would tell her the truth. Vivian said that sounded great. She went back to her house. I went back to mine. My fence was right where it was supposed to be. The HOA had its first fully transparent annual meeting in October, 14 months after everything started. All 5 board seats were open for election. 12 residents put their names in. The vote was held properly. Mailed ballots, 30-day window, counted by an independent tabulator Carrie had hired at membership request. This was what a functioning HOA looked like. I voted. I did not run. Marcus asked why not, and I said because I didn't want the job and I didn't need the authority. I'd done what needed doing. Carrie was good at it and she liked doing it. The right people were in the right place. I was satisfied to be just a homeowner who paid her dues and read her CC and RS. David Sue sent me a copy of a presentation he was giving to an Ohio HOA management conference. A case study on financial oversight best practices, based anonymously on what he'd found in Maplewood Glen. He asked if I objected to the case study. I said no, go ahead, and I asked if I could have a copy of the slides. He sent them. They were very good. One of the things David said in the slides was that the conditions for HOA financial misconduct are almost always the same. Low member engagement, concentrated board power, vague vendor oversight, and a culture where questioning leadership is socially costly. Maplewood Glen had had all 4. Most HOAs in the country, he noted, have at least 2. I thought about that for a few days. I thought about how many people in how many planned communities across the country were living inside someone else's Sandra situation and didn't know it or didn't believe it was worth fighting. I thought about the toll booth metaphor Dale had used and how you don't notice a toll booth until you're stopped at it. I sent the David Seuss slide deck to Patricia Elwood, Dale, Carolyn, the Gwynns, Nina, and Sheila. No cover note, just the slides. Patricia replied immediately with a thumbs up. Carolyn said she was going to share it with her sister who was having problems with her HOA in Maryland. I said please do. Janet closed our file in November. She sent a brief final email. Total recovery, including legal fees and damages and restitution referrals, was $147,000 for me and my neighbors. The court-ordered fence restoration, the audit finding, and the AG plea deal had together produced accountability at every level of what Sandra had built. Not a single component of her system was still standing. The criminal record, the civil judgment, the financial restitution, the mandatory removal of the gate, the resignation, the sale of the house, the dissolution of the company she'd used to funnel money to herself. One by one, everything she'd built with her authority fell apart exactly the way things built on fraud tend to, slowly at first, then completely. I drove past Sandra's old house in December. The Chens had already changed things. The garden beds Sandra had so meticulously maintained were replanted with something less formal. Raised vegetable beds on the south side, a tire swing hung from the large oak that Sandra had always kept pruned into architectural submission. The corner lot looked like a family lived there. Where Sandra's gate had been, there was now a simple opening in a low wooden fence. Just a gap, really enough for a person, a bike, a dog on a leash. Not locked, not monitored, not impressive, just functional. The way an entrance to a home should be. Theo asked me one morning in December if the fence problem was over. I said yes, it was over. He said, "Did you win?" I thought about the word. I said yes. He said, "Good," and went back to his cereal. Children understand justice more clearly than adults because they haven't learned yet to feel guilty for wanting it. Marcus and I marked the anniversary of the fence removal, a year after I'd come home to find the yard smaller, by doing exactly nothing notable. We made pancakes. Till it fall. Deja rode her bike down Cresthaven and back, tires intact, and I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, the morning quiet and cold in mine. The sunflowers had died back by then, of course. It was December, but in my mind I could still see them from the summer, the row of them along the fence line, tall and conspicuous, facing the street like they were explaining something. Theo had been right. They were the tallest, and you could see them from anywhere on the block. I'd been asked twice, by neighbors and once by a journalist from a Columbus lifestyle outlet who'd heard about the story, whether I had any regrets, whether it had been worth it, whether I'd do it again. The answers were no, yes, and yes in that order, and I said so both times without elaborating, because the elaboration is 14 months of documents and I'd rather not. What I will say is this. Sandra Bellworth is not a unique person. She's a pattern. She's what happens when one person decides the community's rules exist to serve them, and enough other people are too busy or too tired or too intimidated to correct that assumption. She was possible because she was allowed to be possible. That's the part that keeps me up, occasionally. Not her specifically, but the system that made her viable. Maplewood Glen is not perfect now. No HOA is. Carrie is a good president, but she's also human and she'll make mistakes and someone will have to call her on them someday. The difference now is that the membership knows they can. They've seen what documentation and persistence and legal knowledge and 12 people willing to give sworn statements can do. That knowledge doesn't go away. The Sandra file, 6 inches thick, tabbed by date, beginning with a certified letter and ending with a plea deal, lives in a box in my home office. I don't look at it. I don't need to. But it's there if anyone ever needs to understand exactly how you undo something that was done illegally with the full expectation that nobody would bother to undo it. Deja found it once, going through the office for tape, and she asked what it was. I said it was paperwork from a neighborhood problem we'd had. She said, "Is that why we had all the lawyers?" I said yes. She said, "Did we win?" I said yes. She said, "Can I see?" I said maybe when she's older. She said that was fair and went back to her room. That was the right answer. Marcus finished coaching Theo's Little League season. They came in second in the league, lost the championship game by 2 runs in the last inning, and Theo cried exactly the appropriate amount and then ate 2 hot dogs and was fine. Normal seasons. Normal losses. Normal things. I went back to work in earnest after the settlement. Actual work, the engineering kind, which I'd been doing throughout but not with my full attention. There's something clarifying about returning to problems that have definitive solutions, where the answer is calculable and the measurements are precise and being right can be verified by anyone with the same instruments. What I'd learned from the whole Sandra experience was that the law is like engineering. It rewards precision, patience, and documentation. It's not romantic. It's not fast. But it works when you apply it correctly, and it works best when the person applying it knows exactly where the line is. I know where the line is. I measured it myself. The Maplewood Glen Community Facebook group had, as of my last count, 112 members, more than double what Sandra had recruited. People posted about lost cats and recommended plumbers and organized a canned food drive. It was unremarkable in the best possible way. A neighborhood talking to itself without anyone managing the message. One post in December caught my eye. Someone new to the neighborhood, the Garcias from Sycamore Lane, asked if there was any documentation of the HOA's landscaping vendor selection process, because they wanted to know how to find HOA-approved contractors. Patricia Elwood replied within minutes. "Great question. All vendor approvals go through the full board and are posted publicly. Here's the link to the current approved list. No gatekeeper. No toll booth. Just information freely given. My fence is exactly where it has always legally been. My yard is the size it has always legally been. The sunflowers will come back in the spring. I put bulbs in before the ground froze, right along the line, because I wanted the line to be visible from the street in the most cheerful way I could manage. Sandra's house has a tire swing now. Her gate space is open. Her company is dissolved. Her bank account is lighter by $103,000. Her criminal record lists 1 guilty plea and 1 no contest plea, and those facts are public in the way that court records are public, permanent, searchable, accurate. People ask if I feel sorry for her. I don't particularly. I feel sorry for the people who paid for her garden, her gate, her pearls, the neighbors who paid HOA dues in good faith for 3 years while their money took a detour into someone else's life. They deserved a fair accounting, and they got one eventually because someone took the time to insist on it. The January morning I woke up and realized the whole thing was truly over. I lay in bed for a moment and thought, she moved my fence 6 feet. That's what started this. 6 feet of earth that she believed she could simply take because she had the title and the procedure and the assumption that nobody would check. I checked. I kept checking until checking was done. What I want anyone to understand who's ever stood on a smaller version of their own property and felt the specific indignity of something being taken by someone who expected to get away with it, you don't have to accept the smaller yard. You don't have to let someone else define the line. Find the original survey. Measure from there. Build out. The line is where it has always been. I just made sure everyone could see it. The END.